What are you doing here?
I am a customer. This is a store.
I do not think so. You need to leave.
She gave her last $20 to a stranger in a thrift coat, then found out who her real mother was. On the last ordinary afternoon of her life, Claire Madison folded a $200 silk scarf for a customer who wouldn't remember her name by the time she reached her car, and had no idea that in less than an hour, a stranger in a threadbare coat would walk through the boutique doors and quietly hand her the answer to a question she had been asking her entire life. Before we get into what happened inside that store, and the letter that would surface 33 years later and change everything Claire thought she knew about herself, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The automatic glass doors of Whitfield's slid open without a sound that Tuesday afternoon in Charleston. Soft music drifted through the boutique as shoppers browsed racks of tailored coats and handcrafted handbags beneath crystal chandeliers that threw soft light across polished marble floors. It was the kind of store where every item seemed to know its own worth, and where the staff had learned, whether they admitted it or not, to size up a customer within seconds of them walking through the door. Nobody in that room, least of all Claire, understood that the woman about to step inside would upend every assumption the boutique had ever made about who deserved respect. She was somewhere in her late 70s, dressed in a faded gray coat that had clearly weathered many winters, her shoes scuffed at the toes, a worn canvas tote slung over one shoulder. A simple wooden cane steadied her as she crossed the threshold. Conversations dimmed. A young associate leaned toward her coworker and murmured just loudly enough to be overheard, wondering aloud if the woman had wandered into the wrong store entirely, and her coworker suggested, with a small laugh, that perhaps she was looking for the thrift shop 2 blocks over. A few employees smiled at the joke and went back to their racks, already certain they knew exactly who this woman was, and exactly how much of their time she deserved. The elderly woman didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she didn't let it show. She moved slowly through the boutique, with calm, unhurried eyes, admiring a display of cashmere coats the way someone might admire an old photograph, like every beautiful thing in the room reminded her of somewhere she had already been. Near the center of the showroom stood Claire, 42 years old, not the newest associate on the floor, and rarely the one who closed the biggest sale of the day, but the one customers remembered afterward, because she never once made a person feel like they had to prove they belonged before she'd speak to them with warmth. Claire had learned that particular kind of patience the hard way. 6 years earlier, she had buried her husband after a sudden heart attack that emptied their savings account within months. Not long after, her father had suffered a stroke, and every paycheck she earned since had gone toward rent, prescriptions, groceries, and a small apartment that only sometimes felt like home. There were evenings she skipped dinner so her father wouldn't have to skip his, and nights she cried quietly once he'd fallen asleep, so he'd never know how frightened she really was. She understood, in a way most of her coworkers didn't, exactly what it felt like to be measured by appearances and found lacking, and that understanding was the reason she smiled the moment she saw the old woman standing near the entrance. Before Claire could cross the floor, the boutique's manager intercepted the woman first. Vivian Sinclair looked as though she had walked directly out of a fashion editorial, every strand of her blonde hair set precisely in place, her tailored blazer worth more than most of her employees earned in 2 months combined. She offered a smile that moved only her mouth, asked the woman what she was looking for today, and when the elderly visitor said simply that she wanted to look around, Vivian folded her arms and mentioned, almost as a warning, that the boutique specialized in luxury collections, that handbags began at $5,000, that the gowns were custom designed for a particular kind of client. The old woman only nodded pleasantly and said she understood completely, and that she'd heard the customer service here was exceptional. Several nearby employees exchanged amused glances at that. Vivian's patience visibly thinned, and she suggested, with the practiced politeness of someone dismissing an inconvenience, that another boutique might better suit the woman's needs today. Claire glanced around the nearly empty store, counted 4 customers total, and understood there was nothing keeping Vivian this busy, except the desire to move the old woman out the door as quickly and quietly as possible. That was the moment Claire stepped forward and offered to help her herself. Vivian warned her under her breath not to waste her afternoon, and Claire answered simply that helping customers was, in fact, her entire job, before walking away to the sound of a coworker predicting she'd spend an hour and make exactly $0 for her trouble. Claire introduced herself, and the old woman offered her name in return, Eleanor, in a voice that carried none of the embarrassment the rest of the room seemed to expect from her. Claire noticed Eleanor rubbing her hands together against the cold and offered her a chair, then disappeared briefly into the back and returned with a bottle of water and the 2 oatmeal cookies she had packed that morning for her own lunch. Eleanor stared at the small offering for a long moment before quietly saying that there weren't many people left like her anymore, and Claire laughed it off, telling her that her father always said kindness never cost a person anything they couldn't afford to give. They sat together for several minutes talking about nothing in particular, the weather, old gardens, favorite books, and Claire realized she was smiling more freely than she had in weeks. Eventually, Eleanor stood, straightened her coat, and said she supposed it was time to actually look around, and Claire happily walked her through the newest collections, the cashmere coats, the hand-stitched Italian leather, the silk scarves imported from small ateliers most customers had never heard of. Unlike most shoppers, Eleanor asked real questions: who had designed each piece, where it had been made, how long the artisans had spent on the stitching, and Claire answered every one of them patiently, while nearly 45 minutes slipped by unnoticed. Across the floor, Vivian checked her watch twice and muttered something about wasted company time to no one in particular, entirely unaware of what was about to happen in front of her. Eleanor stopped in front of a handcrafted handbag, glowing beneath a soft display light, and said simply that she would take it, and Claire nodded happily and logged it into her tablet. Then came a navy cashmere coat, then a pair of leather boots, then an emerald evening gown that Claire assumed, at first, must be the last item on the list, until Eleanor smiled and said she was only just getting started. One beautiful piece after another followed: handbags, tailored jackets, silk blouses, fine leather accessories, until the total on Claire's tablet climbed to a number she had genuinely never seen in her career: $148,670, a figure that would instantly become the largest single sale the boutique had recorded all year. Vivian hurried over the moment she noticed the growing pile of merchandise stacking up near the register, and when Claire explained happily that Eleanor had finished shopping, Vivian's expression shifted into something colder, something that looked almost hopeful in the worst possible way, as though she were waiting for this entire scene to collapse in on itself. Claire reviewed the order calmly and told Eleanor, whenever she was ready, they could check out right at the counter. Eleanor reached into her worn canvas tote, searched once, then searched again, her gentle expression slowly fading into something closer to embarrassment, and finally admitted, quietly, that she seemed to have left her wallet at home. For one full second, the boutique went completely silent. Then the laughter started, sharp and immediate, rippling from one end of the showroom to the other. One associate covered her mouth, failing to hide her amusement. Another folded her arms and murmured that she had known it all along. Vivian let out a slow, mocking laugh and announced to the room that it seemed Claire's customer wasn't quite ready for luxury shopping after all, and several shoppers near the register looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to say a word. Claire, for her part, felt none of the embarrassment everyone around her seemed to expect her to feel on Eleanor's behalf. She simply told her gently that it was all right, that they'd figure something out together. Eleanor looked down at her tote bag and admitted, almost to herself, that she hadn't done something this foolish in years, and Vivian used the pause to step forward, heels striking the marble sharply, announcing that the store had already invested more than enough time in this, and that it would be best if the woman left. Claire tried to speak up, but Vivian raised a hand, reminded her sharply who was in charge, and told Eleanor plainly that the boutique served clients who were prepared to make purchases, a sentence that landed in the room like a closing door. Eleanor only nodded, gathered her tote, and apologized quietly for wasting everyone's time, turning toward the exit without another word of protest. Claire reached into her own purse before Eleanor could take another step. Inside was exactly $38, the only cash she had until her next paycheck, 20 of it already earmarked for groceries, and the rest for her father's prescription. Without a second thought, she pulled out $20 and pressed it gently into Eleanor's hand, insisting it was for a ride home, refusing to take no for an answer, even as Eleanor protested that she couldn't possibly accept it. Claire only smiled and said her father always told her that kindness had a way of finding its way back to a person eventually. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she asked, quietly, whether Claire would really give away her grocery money to someone she had known for less than an hour, and Claire simply said that if her own mother were ever stranded somewhere, she would hope a stranger might do exactly the same for her. Vivian, unmoved by any of it, rolled her eyes, and instructed the security guard to escort the woman outside. The guard hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the whole scene, but slowly approached anyway. Before he could say a word, Eleanor raised a calm hand and told him there was no need, that she would leave on her own, without any trouble. As she passed Claire on her way out, she paused, told her she had a beautiful heart, and when Claire credited her father for it, Eleanor said quietly that he must have raised an extraordinary daughter. Then she reached into her coat pocket, removed a tiny silver brooch shaped like a dove, and pinned it gently onto Claire's jacket, telling her it had belonged to her own mother, and that when life became difficult, Claire should remember this exact day. And then, almost as an afterthought, she added that today wasn't going to end the way anyone in that room currently believed it would. Claire frowned, confused, and Eleanor only glanced toward the front windows with a peaceful, knowing smile, and said that her son had arrived. Every head in the boutique turned at once. Outside, a long black sedan rolled to a stop directly in front of the entrance, followed by a second car, then a third, then two more, 5 identical vehicles lining the curb in perfect formation. The laughter inside the store died instantly. Employees exchanged confused, uneasy glances as a chauffeur hurried to open the rear door, and several men in dark suits stepped out first, scanning the sidewalk with quiet, practiced precision before a distinguished man in his late 50s emerged from the center car, silver-haired, immaculately dressed, carrying himself with the unmistakable weight of someone used to rooms going quiet the moment he entered them. There was no need for introductions. Everyone in that boutique recognized the name the instant it crossed their minds. Nathaniel Whitfield, founder and chief executive of Whitfield Luxury Group, the very company that owned this store and more than 200 others just like it across North America. Vivian's face drained of color as she straightened her blazer so quickly she nearly stumbled, and a chorus of nervous greetings rippled through the staff the moment he stepped through the doors. Nathaniel acknowledged none of them. His eyes swept the room until they landed on Eleanor, and his composed expression melted instantly into the unguarded warmth of a son who had clearly been searching for his mother for the better part of an afternoon. He crossed the floor without a word and pulled her into an embrace, and when he finally noticed the tears still gathered in her eyes, his smile disappeared entirely. He asked her plainly what had happened, and before Eleanor could answer, Vivian stepped forward with the brightest smile she could manage, gushing about what an honor it was to finally meet him, claiming she'd had no idea his mother was visiting the store today. Nathaniel turned toward her slowly, his expression unreadable, and told her that his mother didn't require an appointment to walk into one of his own stores. When Vivian stammered something about maintaining their standards, he asked her, quietly, exactly what standards she believed she'd been maintaining, and the room fell so silent that someone's breathing was audible from across the floor. He asked his mother directly whether she had been treated with respect inside this store, and Eleanor, after a long pause, answered honestly that one person had shown her genuine kindness and reached for Claire's hand as she said it. Nathaniel looked at Claire for the first time, and she lowered her eyes instinctively, insisting quietly that she'd only been trying to help. Eleanor told him everything without hesitation. How Claire had offered her water and her own lunch, how she had defended her when the laughter started, and how she had handed over her own money the moment the boutique tried to throw her out onto the sidewalk. Nathaniel's expression hardened as he turned toward the assembled staff and asked, plainly, whether any of what his mother had just described was true. Nobody answered. Nobody dared to. He turned back to Claire and asked her name, and when she told him, he said quietly that his mother rarely spoke that highly of anyone, and Claire, cheeks warm with embarrassment, simply told him she had treated Eleanor the way she hoped someone would treat her own father. For the first time since walking through the door, Nathaniel smiled, a real one this time, and told his mother she had been right about her. Then he turned toward one of the men trailing behind him and asked, calmly, that the front doors be locked. Every employee in the room exchanged a nervous glance. Nobody was leaving yet, and everybody understood, without needing to be told, that something significant was about to unfold inside that boutique. If this story is pulling at your heart already, take a moment right now to like this video, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and share it with someone who still believes kindness matters. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because we genuinely love hearing from viewers across every corner of this country. Now, back inside that quiet, locked boutique, where Nathaniel Whitfield was only just getting started. He asked Vivian how long she had managed this location, and when she answered nearly 6 years with a forced, confident smile, he asked her plainly whether, in all that time, she had ever judged a customer by the clothes they wore. She insisted, "Of course not," though her voice wavered just slightly on the second word. Nathaniel glanced toward his mother, who said nothing at all, simply lowering her eyes, and that silence carried more weight than any accusation could have. He asked to see the security footage, and Vivian's face lost what little color remained in it as she confirmed, in a smaller voice than before, that the cameras recorded both video and audio. He asked that the recording be brought up on the office monitor and invited everyone inside to watch it together, employees, witnesses, even Claire, though nobody quite understood why yet. The footage began with Eleanor stepping quietly through the entrance, and the room watched in uncomfortable silence as every dismissive glance, every whispered joke, every cruel remark played back with painful clarity through the microphones that had captured it all. One voice speculated that she'd wandered in looking for the thrift store. Another laughed that she probably couldn't afford the shopping bag she was carrying. A third voice, closer to the counter, remarked that Claire always seemed to find the hopeless customers. Several people in the room lowered their heads as their own voices echoed back at them. Then the footage showed Claire, offering a chair, bringing water, handing over her own lunch, patiently answering every question exactly the way she would have for any other customer in the building. The recording continued through the shopping itself, the growing pile of merchandise, Vivian standing nearby with her arms crossed, waiting. Then came the moment Eleanor discovered her missing wallet, and the laughter that followed played back through the office speakers with an ugliness that hadn't been quite so obvious in the moment. Nathaniel's jaw tightened visibly. The footage showed Claire quietly pulling $20 from her own purse, and watching herself on the screen, she suddenly noticed how tired she looked in that moment, how worn her own coat had become, without her ever really registering it. Then came Vivian ordering the guard to escort Eleanor out of the store, and Nathaniel paused the recording right there, letting the silence stretch until it became almost unbearable. He asked Vivian, quietly, if she would like to explain herself, and when she offered that it had simply been a mistake, he corrected her without raising his voice at all, telling her that a mistake was forgetting an appointment or shipping the wrong order, but what had happened here had been a choice. He told her she had chosen arrogance, chosen humiliation, chosen to embarrass an elderly woman because she assumed she wasn't wealthy enough to deserve basic respect. Vivian's eyes filled with tears as she tried to explain she'd never intended any harm, and Nathaniel interrupted her gently to explain that his mother had lost his father 30 years earlier, and that for nearly 2 years afterward, she had dressed exactly the way she had today, because she'd donated most of her wardrobe to women who had escaped dangerous homes and needed clothing more than she did. He told the room that the handbag Eleanor had carried into the store that day was the very same one she had carried while helping build his father's first company from nothing, and Eleanor, smiling faintly, admitted she'd simply never found one she liked better. Nathaniel looked back at his staff and told them plainly that his mother didn't need expensive clothing to prove who she was, and neither did anyone else who walked through their doors. He turned to Claire and asked whether she had known any of this about Eleanor beforehand, and when she said no, that she had simply believed her to be an ordinary woman, he asked why she had treated her with such dignity anyway. Claire answered simply that she had treated her like a human being, nothing more complicated than that, and Nathaniel told her that his mother always said true character reveals itself when there's nothing to gain, and that she appeared to have been right once again. Vivian stepped forward one final time, apologizing directly, and Nathaniel asked her, without cruelty but without softness either, whether she was sorry for what she had done, or simply sorry that she now knew exactly who his mother was. She had no answer for that, and the silence that followed answered the question for her. A representative from Human Resources arrived moments later, and Nathaniel informed Vivian that her employment with Whitfield Luxury Group had ended, effective immediately. When she pleaded that she had a mortgage and bills to consider, he told her, evenly, that Claire had those same obligations, and that Vivian had fired her without a moment's hesitation regardless. Security stepped beside her, and for the first time in years, she was the one being escorted out rather than the one issuing the orders. Before she reached the doors, Vivian stopped in front of Claire, tears streaking her face, and told her simply that she was sorry. Claire looked at her for a long moment before answering quietly that she hoped she meant it, and Vivian, lowering her head, said that she did, before walking out without another word. The remaining staff stood in uneasy silence, several visibly ashamed, a few wiping at their eyes. Nathaniel addressed them directly, informing them that everyone who had laughed that afternoon would spend the next month volunteering at one of the company's community outreach centers. Not as punishment, he clarified, but as education, serving meals, helping struggling families, and learning something no amount of money could ever teach them. Nobody argued. Then he turned back to Claire and told her that his mother had mentioned she'd been fired, and Claire confirmed it quietly. He said he intended to fix that, and when she thanked him but explained she wasn't sure she could come back after everything that had happened, the room went quiet once more. He looked surprised, and she explained gently that while she had loved helping customers, she no longer felt certain her heart belonged in this particular store. To everyone's surprise, Nathaniel's smile only widened, and he told her he'd been hoping she would say exactly that, because he had no intention of bringing her back as a sales associate. Eleanor laughed quietly beside them, admitting she had known precisely what her son was planning all along, and Claire looked between the two of them in complete confusion as Nathaniel reached into his briefcase and placed a cream-colored folder gently into her hands. She opened it slowly, read the contents twice to make sure she'd understood correctly, and whispered that it couldn't possibly be real. Nathaniel assured her that it was, and in that quiet moment, standing in a boutique that had humiliated her only hours earlier, Claire understood that her life was about to change in ways she had never once dared to imagine. What she couldn't have known yet was that this would only be the first of two impossible discoveries waiting for her that year, because hundreds of miles away, in a small retirement community outside Asheville, a woman she had never met was about to see her face flash across a television screen and drop her teacup in shock. 72-year-old Dorothy Malone sat alone that evening in her small living room outside Asheville, a cup of tea cooling untouched on the table beside her, while the evening news played quietly in the background, more for company than for anything she was actually watching. When the anchor introduced a story about a boutique employee whose kindness toward an elderly stranger had gone viral across the country, Dorothy glanced up out of idle curiosity, smiled faintly at the segment, and then went completely still the instant the camera zoomed in on Claire's face. Her teacup slipped from her fingers and shattered against the floor as she leaned closer to the screen, certain of something she hadn't let herself think about in over 3 decades, whispering that it couldn't possibly be her, and then, more quietly, that it was. 33 years earlier, Dorothy had worked as a labor and delivery nurse at a county hospital, and one stormy autumn night, a frightened young woman barely 20 years old had arrived alone carrying a newborn baby girl, crying for hours and repeating the same devastating sentence over and over, that she couldn't give her daughter the life she deserved. Dorothy had held that tiny baby while the young mother signed adoption papers through tears, and before leaving the hospital for the last time, the mother had wrapped a small silver bracelet around her daughter's wrist, telling Dorothy that if her daughter ever came looking for her one day, that bracelet would tell her she had never once stopped loving her. Dorothy had carried that memory for 33 years, certain now that the grown woman on her television screen was that very same baby. She hurried to an old cedar chest in her bedroom closet, dug through decades of preserved keepsakes from her nursing career, hospital bracelets, faded photographs, handwritten thank you notes, until she finally found the file she'd been searching for, complete with a photograph of the newborn she had once held. She compared it against the frozen image on her television screen, and the resemblance left no room for doubt in her mind. The following morning, she called the local news station that had aired the segment, explaining carefully that she wasn't seeking money or attention, only that she believed this young woman deserved to know the truth about where she had come from. The producer promised to pass the information along, unaware of just how much it would change everything for everyone involved. Meanwhile, Claire's life had already become something close to unrecognizable. Newspapers wanted interviews. Television programs wanted appearances. Letters poured into Whitfield headquarters from strangers across the country, some thanking her, some sharing their own stories of kindness they had witnessed, others simply wanting to encourage her. Claire read every single one she could get her hands on. One afternoon, Nathaniel found her buried in a stack of handwritten notes and asked, half joking, if she planned to answer every single letter personally. She told him she wanted people to know that someone had actually heard them, and he shook his head, telling her she truly hadn't changed a bit since the day they'd met. She only smiled and said she hoped she never would. Moments later, his assistant knocked and informed them that a television producer had arrived unannounced, insisting the matter was personal rather than professional. When the producer sat across from them, visibly nervous, she explained she wasn't there for an interview and slid an old photograph across the table. a newborn baby wrapped in a hospital blanket, a tiny silver bracelet attached to it. She explained gently that a retired nurse had contacted the station, believing Claire might be the very same baby in that photograph, and that she had information about her birth family. Claire froze completely. She had grown up in foster care, had never known her parents or why she'd been given up, and had long ago stopped asking questions because the answers never seemed to come. Now, for the first time in her life, someone claimed to actually know. 2 days later, Nathaniel drove Claire and Eleanor to the retirement community outside Asheville, Claire's mind racing the entire way with every possible outcome, wondering whether this was all some terrible mistake, whether the truth might hurt more than simply never knowing. Eleanor reached across the seat at one point and told her gently that, whatever happened, Claire already had a family who loved her completely, and that promise seemed to steady her nerves just enough to walk through the door when they finally arrived. Dorothy was waiting outside, and the moment she saw Claire step out of the car, tears streamed down her face as she whispered that she had her mother's smile, and confirmed, when Claire asked, that she had indeed held her only hours after she was born. The two women embraced for a long moment, while Nathaniel and Eleanor quietly stepped back to give them privacy. When they finally sat down together, Dorothy opened the old hospital file, revealing birth records, a faded photograph, and one sealed envelope she had kept untouched for over 3 decades. She explained that Claire's birth mother had asked her to hold on to it, in case her daughter ever came looking. Written across the front in faded blue ink were 5 simple words, "For my precious little girl," and Claire's hands trembled as she reached for it, understanding that everything she believed about her own beginning was about to change completely, and unaware that the letter itself was only the first of several revelations still waiting for her that year. If this story has moved you so far, please take a second to like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and share it with someone who still believes in kindness. And let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight, because we love seeing this community grow from every corner of the country. Now, back to that quiet room outside Asheville, where Claire was finally about to read the words her mother had written for her more than 3 decades earlier. Claire stared at the envelope for what felt like an eternity before finally opening it, and inside was a single sheet of delicate handwriting, as though the person who'd written it had been almost afraid the paper itself might break beneath the weight of what she needed to say. The letter began simply, addressing her as a precious daughter, explaining that if she was reading these words, then somehow life had brought her back to a truth her mother had prayed for every single day since. She learned that her birth mother's name was Sarah Bellamy, and that she had been young, frightened, with no money and no home, and no one willing to help her keep her own child. The letter explained that she had looked at Claire's tiny face every night, wondering how she could possibly protect her from a life of struggle, insisting that keeping her had been what she wanted more than anything, but that love sometimes demanded the hardest choice a person could ever make. The letter went on to describe how Dorothy had promised to find her daughter a loving home, a promise Sarah had trusted completely, even as it broke her heart to sign the papers. She wrote that she had never once forgotten Claire's birthday, never forgotten the little bracelet she'd wrapped around her wrist, and that every single year on the day Claire was born, she lit a candle and prayed that wherever her daughter had ended up, someone was teaching her kindness. Claire lowered the letter for a moment, overwhelmed, before continuing to the final passages, where her mother wrote that her greatest hope had always been that Claire would grow into a woman who saw people's hearts before their circumstances, someone who never measured another person's worth by their possessions, because kindness, she wrote, was the only inheritance worth passing down. The final lines told Claire that if she was happy, her mother was happy, that if she was loved, her mother was finally at peace, and that the hardest part of giving her away had never been the act itself, but living every day afterward without knowing whether her daughter had turned out all right. The letter closed simply, with love forever, from her mother, Sarah. Claire broke down completely, not entirely from sadness, but from finally holding proof, tangible proof, that she had been loved, and that she had mattered to someone from the very first moment of her life. Dorothy apologized for how long it had taken for that proof to reach her, and Claire shook her head, insisting there was nothing to apologize for, that she had spent her whole life believing nobody had chosen her, when in truth, her mother had made the hardest choice imaginable, precisely because she loved her so completely. Nathaniel watched quietly from across the room, having already seen Claire absorb insults, lose her job, and stand firm while an entire boutique judged her within minutes of meeting her. But this, watching her finally receive an answer to a question that had haunted her entire life, was something else entirely. Later that evening, back at the estate, Claire sat alone in the garden watching the city lights flicker in the distance. And when Nathaniel joined her and asked if she was all right, she admitted that for years she had believed her story began with being abandoned, but now understood it had actually begun with someone loving her enough to make an unbearable sacrifice. He told her that was a powerful thing to finally understand, and she added, almost to herself, that the people who had actually built her future weren't the ones who gave her life, but the ones she had met along the way. Eleanor joined them a few minutes later, mentioning gently that there was something else Claire needed to know, something about her birth mother that hadn't fully come out yet. She explained that Sarah Bellamy hadn't simply been a frightened young stranger who arrived at a hospital alone that night, but had actually come from considerable wealth, the daughter of one of the most respected businessmen in North Carolina, a man who had cut her off completely the moment he learned she was pregnant outside the marriage he had approved for her. Claire sat with that information in stunned silence, realizing her mother hadn't been poor because she had nothing to begin with, but because she had lost everything the moment her family turned their backs on her. Eleanor added quietly that before Sarah disappeared from her life all those years ago, she had told her one last thing, that if her daughter ever found her someday, she hoped she would inherit her kindness, rather than the bitterness that had once nearly consumed her. Everything suddenly made a strange kind of sense to Claire. Her compassion, her refusal to judge people at first glance, her willingness to forgive so easily. Perhaps kindness wasn't something she had simply learned along the way, but something she had carried inside her the entire time, passed down from a mother she had never known. Before she could fully sit with that thought, Nathaniel's assistant appeared at the garden entrance, informing them that someone had arrived asking specifically for Claire. When Claire asked who, the assistant hesitated for only a moment before answering that the visitor had given her name as Sarah Bellamy. Claire's heart stopped completely. For 33 years she had wondered, imagined, and quietly prayed. And now, after all that waiting, her mother was standing only a few steps away, inside the very same house. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who believes kindness can genuinely change a life. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from today, because we love hearing from viewers across the country and beyond, and your support genuinely helps us keep bringing you more stories exactly like this one. Claire couldn't move for several seconds, certain she must have misheard the name entirely. When the assistant confirmed it again, she rose slowly on unsteady legs and asked where the woman was waiting. She was told the sitting room, and Claire looked first at Nathaniel and then at Eleanor, and neither of them spoke, because both of them understood this particular moment belonged entirely to her. She walked through the mansion, with every step feeling heavier than the last. 33 years of questions and quiet wondering, compressed into the short distance between where she stood and the door in front of her. She reached for the handle and hesitated, suddenly terrified by every possibility at once, that the woman inside might not recognize her, might regret coming at all, that the truth waiting on the other side might hurt more than the not knowing ever had. Eleanor placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and told her that whatever happened next, she would still be exactly the same remarkable woman she had been before opening that door. Claire took a slow breath and finally stepped inside. A woman stood near the window, her hair silvered with age, her face carrying the particular weight of decades of sadness and quiet strength. But her eyes were unmistakable, the same eyes Claire had seen in her own mirror for 42 years. The moment the woman turned around, both of them froze completely still. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said Claire's name, and something inside Claire broke open at the sound of it. She asked how the woman could possibly know her name, and Sarah answered simply that she had spoken it every single day for 33 years. Claire crossed the room without another word, and Sarah stepped forward to meet her, and then they were holding each other, an entire lifetime of missing moments folding into one single embrace. Sarah cried into her daughter's shoulder, apologizing over and over, and Claire held her tightly, admitting through her own tears that she had spent years wondering if her mother had simply hated her. Sarah pulled back sharply at that, insisting she had loved Claire every single day, every morning and every night, carrying her in her heart, even during all the years she couldn't carry her in her arms. Claire asked, gently, why she had never come looking for her, and Sarah explained that she had tried, for years, but that her father had held far too much power and had convinced everyone around them that giving Claire away had been the only reasonable choice. Claire asked about her father, and Sarah explained that his name had been Edward Bellamy, a name that visibly registered with Nathaniel, who confirmed that everyone in business circles recognized it, that Edward Bellamy had built Bellamy Industries into one of the largest firms in the region before his death. Sarah explained that when she had become pregnant, her father had been furious, humiliated by what he considered a disgrace to the family name, and had given her an impossible choice: give up her child or lose everything she had ever known. Claire's eyes filled with anger at the thought, and Eleanor quietly noted that Edward Bellamy might have been a brilliant businessman, but he had clearly forgotten, somewhere along the way, how to be human. Sarah admitted she had refused at first to give Claire up, but that she'd had no money, no home, and no one willing to help her, except for Dorothy, who had ultimately protected them both when nobody else would. Sarah wasn't finished. She explained that when her father passed away, he had left behind specific instructions, including a trust established for the daughter he had once forced her to give up, admitting before his death that he had spent his entire life building wealth, only to realize, far too late, that he had destroyed the one relationship that had ever truly mattered. According to that trust, Claire was the rightful heir to a company she had never once heard of. Claire stood in stunned silence, insisting immediately that she didn't want anyone's money, that she had spent her whole life learning how to survive on her own terms, learning that people mattered infinitely more than possessions ever could, and that she refused to let sudden wealth change who she had worked so hard to become. Sarah told her, gently, that this was precisely why she deserved it, and Nathaniel added that she understood better than almost anyone that money itself was never the real problem, only the character of the person holding it, and that Claire could use an inheritance like this one to help thousands of people rather than simply keeping it for herself. Eleanor reminded her softly that true wealth was never measured by what a person kept, only by what they were willing to give away. Claire looked down at the documents in her hands and, instead of seeing dollar signs, began seeing possibilities: scholarships for children who needed them, emergency assistance for struggling families, second chances for people the world had already written off. She decided in that moment that she had no interest in simply owning an empire, only in rebuilding one into something that actually changed lives rather than merely selling products. Months passed, and the world watched something remarkable unfold. Claire Madison, the woman once mocked openly for her modest coat and simple shoes, became one of the most respected names in the industry, and yet she never changed. She still greeted every employee by name. She still listened more than she spoke. She still stopped to help strangers on ordinary afternoons, exactly the way she always had. Under her direction, both companies adopted a simple new promise: that no person walking through their doors would ever again be judged by their appearance. Scholarships were created. Emergency assistance programs launched. Career opportunities opened for people who had simply never been given a fair chance before, and Claire personally visited store after store across the country to see the changes take root herself. 1 year after the afternoon that had changed everything, she returned to the very same Charleston boutique where it had all begun. The same glass doors slid open. The same chandeliers still glittered overhead, but everything about the place felt entirely different now. Employees stood a little taller. Customers smiled a little more freely. Near the entrance, a small brass plaque had been mounted on the wall, reading simply that every person who walked through these doors deserved dignity. Claire ran her fingers gently across the engraved words, thinking back to the elderly woman everyone in that room had once mocked without a second thought. The same woman who had ended up quietly rewriting the entire course of her life. Eleanor, standing beside her, asked softly if she was happy, and Claire admitted that she believed she had finally found exactly what she had spent her whole life searching for, without realizing it: a place where kindness genuinely mattered more than anything else. As they walked back outside together, Nathaniel was already waiting by the car, holding the door open for them both. Claire laughed and reminded him she was perfectly capable of opening her own door, and he only smiled and admitted that he simply liked taking care of her. Years earlier, she had walked into a luxury boutique, feeling completely invisible to the people around her. Now the whole country knew her name, though the greatest thing she had gained through all of it was never the money, or the title, or the sudden fame. It was love. It was family, and it was the quiet, unshakable understanding that even the smallest act of kindness could completely alter the direction of another person's life. Because the truth, Claire had come to understand, is that you never really know who someone is, simply by looking at them. The person you overlook today could be the very same person who changes your entire tomorrow. And sometimes the greatest treasures in life aren't found inside expensive boutiques at all. They're found in the smallest moments. A kind word offered freely. A helping hand extended without hesitation. A simple decision to see a person for who they are, rather than what they happen to be wearing that day. Claire Madison never forgot the afternoon an entire boutique mocked a tired old woman in a faded coat, because that was the day she finally learned the most important lesson of her life, that kindness is the one luxury every single person can afford, and it remains, to this day, the most valuable thing anyone can ever give. Thank you so much for following this story all the way through. If it moved you even a little, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still believes kindness can change a life. And before you go, let us know in the comments exactly where you're watching from tonight, because we truly love hearing from viewers across this entire country and beyond. And every comment genuinely helps us keep bringing you more stories exactly like this one. Thank you for spending this time with us, and we'll see you again very soon.